So, as a person who reads the news a lot, I can tell you that after every mass shooting, there are three things that people want to know first. The first is how many people died. 17, 25, 30. The numbers get higher and higher every time. And every time, we get more and more used to it. The next is, whose fault is it? Is it the parents' fault for not realizing the criminal is showing unusual behavior? Is it the government's fault for giving the criminal the gun? The possibilities are endless. And it's funny because sometimes we get so caught up blaming others that we forget to blame the criminal themselves. The last is less of a question and more of a realization. A realization that no crime is silent. That before every crime is committed, there are always warning signs beforehand. And sometimes we'll look back and we'll realize that we missed every single one of them. Now, I'm not trying to scare you, but what I am trying to say is you need to be able to tell how someone close to you could possibly be at risk for future violent crime. Now, that question, how do you know if someone close to you could be at risk for future violent crime, sparked a lot of interest in me. And it inspired me to do a little bit of research. So I researched 15 different murderers, ranging from serial killers such as Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, to mass murderers such as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. And as I was researching these individuals, I was really less concerned with what they had done, although they were very horrible things. I was more concerned with where these people had come from, their personalities, their backgrounds, their family lives, and before long, I started noticing some commonalities. For example, 10 out of the 15 murders I researched had a difficult family life or childhood. 10 out of 15 were involved in a case of juvenile delinquency or a past instance of crime prior to their murders. 9 out of 15 were described as being shy or antisocial, and 8 out of 15 were suicidal or depressed. So I continued with my research, and every time I noticed a similarity, I would write it down. I ended up with a list of about 30 terms. I associated each of these terms with a potential risk factor for violent crime, and in doing so, I realized that some of these terms were more frequent and more associated with violent crime than others. So I decided to assign each term a point value. Terms that were the most frequent and most associated with violent crime got a point value of 0 to 5. Terms that were somewhat frequent and somewhat associated with violent crime got a point value of 0 to 4, and the rest got a point value of 0 to 3. So at this point, I revised a little bit, took out some terms, added some terms, and I ended up with this 23-term assessment that could be used to determine an individual's risk of future violent crime. And like I said before, each term had a point value of 0 to 5, 0 to 4, or 0 to 3. And if you added up all these point values, you would get a total point value out of 88, which could be used to determine an individual's risk of future violent crime. So I called this the Risk of Violence Assessment, or ROVA. And now that I had this assessment, I wanted to see how it would work. So I made a public survey. And this survey would basically allow its respondents to assess themselves using the Risk of Violence Assessment. And as you can see, the average score from the survey respondents was around 25.5. So at first I was like, oh my God, they're all murderers, which wasn't exactly the case. However, it did make me realize that no one risk factor alone is necessarily indicative of violent crime. For example, one of the risk factors I identified was having a difficult family life or childhood. But lots of kids have a difficult family life or childhood and come out of it completely okay. Another risk factor I identified was being extremely shy or antisocial. But you could just be an old lady who lives with her cats. So having a few risk factors here and there or a score below 30 on the risk of violence assessment is considered completely normal. However, a multitude of these factors combined can get a little bit dangerous. Let's look at a few examples. Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. He had a seemingly normal childhood until his parents divorced, and it was around this time that he developed an obsession with the body parts of dead animals. Then he attended the military at one point, but was asked to leave due to his excessive drinking problems. Later, he would work at a chocolate factory where he assaulted a 13-year-old boy. Then he moved to Milwaukee, where he would be free to commit the rest of his crimes until he finally confessed. Dahmer scored a 48 out of 88 on the risk of violence assessment, and he was just 18 when he committed his first act of violence. Next, I looked at Eric Harris, one of the 2 Columbine school shooters. And just like Jeffrey Dahmer, Eric Harris also had a seemingly normal childhood, but was described as being shy. In high school, Eric Harris made a series of violent cartoons with his friends. Also in high school, when his girlfriend refused to go out with him, he staged a fake suicide. In another case, when his friend got into an argument with him, he put firecrackers in his friend's window. So as you can tell, he was involved in multiple cases of juvenile delinquency. And in his journal, which is open to the public, he wrote about smoking and drinking with his friends and having violent fantasies involving killing others. He even wrote about the school shooting. And when he did, he used the code words NBK, standing for natural born killers. He also wrote about being depressed, bullied, and mistreated. And in total, he scored a 63 out of 88. He was just 18 when he carried out the Columbine school shooting. So because I looked at Eric Harris, I thought it would only be fair if I also looked at Dylan Klebold, the second Columbine school shooter. And again, just like Jeffrey Dahmer and Eric Harris, Dylan Klebold also had a seemingly normal childhood, but was described as being shy. Dylan Klebold showed several of the risk factors that Eric Harris did, but was different in the fact that he had a very strange obsession. In his journal, which is open to the public, Dylan Klebold wrote about having been obsessed with this girl to the point where he dreamed about being with her in the afterlife. But he had never supposedly met or talked to this girl on that level. He also wrote about being depressed, bullied, and mistreated, and in total, he scored a 57 out of 88. He was just 17 when he carried out the Columbine school shooting with Eric Harris. So as I had said before, the average score from the survey respondents was around 25.5. And the average score from the example assessments of Jeffrey Dahmer, Eric Harris, and Dylan Klebold was around 56 or so. So using this information, I sort of decided that a score below 30 on the risk of violence assessment would be considered normal, while a score of 45 and above would be enough to indicate that an individual was at risk for future violent crime. So as you can see, the risk of violence assessment is able to create this huge distinction between those who are at risk for violent crime and those who aren't. And that proves that the risk of violence assessment is able to fulfill its purpose. But still, there are some limitations. For one, you need a lot of background information. The more background information, the better. But of course, it actually has to be accurate. So information coming straight from the subject themselves is strongly encouraged. But of course, what if the assessment is wrong? What if you do the assessment on an individual and it says they're at risk for violent crime when really they aren't? And that's a really good question. You see, the risk of violence assessment is still in its initial stages. A few errors along the way are completely inevitable. But in many cases, it's worth the risk. To help you understand this a little bit better, I'll have to take you a few steps back. Around the time I was initially researching for the risk of violence assessment was actually around the time of the Parkland shooting. And as you all know, the shooting at Parkland was a very big deal. It was all over the news, and it sparked this huge debate about gun legislation, which made me realize the importance of including a very recent and therefore more relevant event in my research, and so I did. And I used the risk of violence assessment to assess Nicholas Cruz. And just as I'd expected, Cruz showed a variety of risk factors prior to his crime. His mother had died of pneumonia, and he was asked to live with an adoptive family. In his youth, he would abuse animals and steal from his neighbors, and when confronted about it, he would show little guilt or remorse. He attended a school for kids with special needs for a period of time. When he returned to a normal high school, he was far from ready. He engaged in several fights over his ex-girlfriend and posted about self-harm on Snapchat. Most importantly, Cruz posted a comment on YouTube claiming he wanted to be a professional school shooter prior to the shooting. Cruz qualified for 20 out of the 23 risk factors in the risk of violence assessment. He scored a 75 out of 88. That's higher than Jeffrey Dahmer and both the Columbine school shooters. So at this point, you may be wondering why. If he showed so many risk factors, then why is it that nobody noticed? And the thing is, they did, but that's often far from enough. In an interview with the serial killer Edmund Kemper, he said that during his first 2 murders, there were at least 3 different times where somebody could have stopped him. 3 different people that could have stopped him, but they were too scared to act upon their own doubt because they didn't know it was something so serious. Just like they didn't know for Eric Harris, Dylan Klebold, Jeffrey Dahmer, Nicholas Cruz, and just like they don't know for all the kids who are right now, in this moment, showing the risk factors for violent behavior and growing closer and closer to homicidal tendencies. And it's possible that nobody will notice them too until it's too late. So I'm not trying to freak you out, but what I am trying to say is that although the risk of violence assessment can fulfill its purpose, there's still this overarching question of when. When do we know to use a risk of violence assessment on somebody? And to that I say it's not the responsibility of the government or mental health facilities, but rather it's the responsibility of the people, of you, of the friends, of the parents, and the educators as well, to notice when a child is going through something and to not be afraid to speak up. I know it sounds impossible, but to visualize this, we might even look at a hypothetical situation. Let's say our subject is a boy in high school and he's been showing some very dangerous or risky behavior. Regardless of what exactly this behavior is, it gets to the point where the teachers start to notice. And when the teachers start to notice, they can alert the school counselor, who can then have a one-on-one meeting with the subject where the counselor can give a shortened version of the risk of violence assessment or a screening. And if by using this screening, the counselor determines that the subject could possibly be at risk for future violent crime, then the counselor can then alert the parents, who are then advised to meet with a mental health professional outside of school. And if what's meeting with this mental health professional, the mental health professional can give the full version of the risk of violence assessment, then the mental health professional can use that assessment to test the subject again. And if again the subject is deemed at risk for future violent crime, then the mental health professional can give recommendations to treatment plans, including counseling or therapy, that can help the subject improve in certain areas. So it sounds complicated. But the thing is, similar methods are already in place. The difference is that the risk of violence assessment is able to address some issues that these other assessments cannot. Now, I'm not trying to say that any of these other assessments are useless or that we should abandon them, because that's not true at all. However, the risk of violence assessment, being very broad and inclusive, can definitely be a great addition to this list. Now, there's one more thing, and that lies in the attitude of the people. The purpose of the risk of violence assessment isn't to tell society which kids to avoid or ridicule or isolate. It's to tell society these are the kids we need to help, and to help them before it's too late. We have everything we need right here. We have governments, we have mental health facilities, and now we even have an assessment. For the first time, stopping violent crime can truly be our choice. Thank you.